functioning under such time constraints. Those of you who know me know that limiting my conversation to a half an hour is kind of rough when you have a subject like the community. I can speak so long and passionately about it. But I would like to start by giving all honor and praises to the Holy One of Israel and to his anointed, to all those that are in search of truth, peace, justice, love, mercy. On this planet, I greet you, Shalom Aleichem.
Aleichem Shalom.
On behalf of the 3,000 or so Hebrew Israelites in Dimona, in Yerucham, in Mitzpeh Ramon, in Arad, in Tiberias, in Tel Aviv, I want to thank the university. I want to thank Nir and Fran for making this possible, the dean, Lynn. I want to thank them for offering us this opportunity to dialogue, indeed, with our family and friends here in the Native community. And I think that it's going to be all of what Lynn was sharing about wanting to know the connection and how we connect to Africa. Indeed, when Nir brings his groups to Dimona, many times I have actually spoken to them, and one of the first things I do whenever I speak to any group, whether they're Israeli or Jews from the U.S. or from London, I'm one of the English spokespersons for the community. One of the first things I do is say, "Welcome to Northeast Africa." And the reality is, and I know that the dean, his field is geology and geography and geopolitics and what have you, borders and boundaries. I know that he would have to agree that we are on the African tectonic plate. When you're on your way down to the Sea of Life, as we call it, the Dead Sea, when you go down to the sea, there's a place that the Park Service has erected there, and they have these plaques out in the middle of an open area there showing the different features of the great African-Syrian Rift Valley. And it actually very, very clearly demonstrates that where we are right now is part of what is called the African tectonic plate. The ibex that inhabit the hillsides of Ain Gedi and Mitzpeh Ramon, they're called the Nubian ibex, and Nubia was further south than contemporary Egypt. And so, and then when you talk about Hebrew, and when you study philology or the linguistics of and cultural connections of languages, Hebrew is classified as an Afro-Semitic or Afro-Asiatic language. We are in Africa. It is not just our neighbor, but we are actually in Northeast Africa, and that's what we've always insisted upon. And I think I'll get to the importance of that and how important that is for the larger Israeli society of which we are a part. I was blessed today to bring 3 of my sons. They're in the back row there. They are following in the footsteps of their older brothers and sisters who, when we were finally, after a 20-year struggle, when we were finally allowed to gain a residency foothold here in the land and didn't have to fight the Ministry of Interior, now we can fight the adversaries of Israel, and we have demonstrated our love and sincerity about being in this land and how we love this land. They will follow in the footsteps of their older brothers and sisters who have served in the IDF, and we're happy about being able to demonstrate our commitment and love of this land and its people at that kind of level. I first met the dean when we went to a program. I attended a program on the 100th anniversary of World War I. And I was in Jerusalem, I attended, I listened, and my interest in the 100th anniversary, which was last year of the beginning of World War I, was from an African perspective. I mean, logically, being of African origin, African ancestry, that would be our point of reference. And so, our looking at World War I, I didn't hear anything. You hear the usual about the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand and what have you as leading up to World War I. But actually, I back up at least another 30 years prior, and I look at the Berlin Conference as an attempt of Europe to head off the animosities and the friction that was developing over the scramble for African colonies. And so therefore, and this is not something new, W.B. Du Bois in the Atlantic magazine back in 1914 talked about this, 1915 he talked about this, where he looked at the origins of World War I as having African roots. And so the breakdown of the civility that the Berlin Conference had hoped to bring to the table, the breakdown had occurred long before the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. And so that's an African perspective. It doesn't mean that one perspective is necessarily wrong, but it does help us when we're looking at particular issues to be able to look at them from a variety of angles, and then we can deduce the bigger picture. I'm glad that some of the other members of the community came in just now. We have a large contingent of those who are arriving to celebrate with us here this week on Wednesday, Thursday, Yom Revi'i and Yom Kamashi. We're celebrating Pesach Malchuti. It is the observance of our arrival in fact, our exodus from America in 1967. We were slaves in America. That's our history. America for us, in my view, was nothing more, nothing less than a land of captivity. Malcolm X used to say a cat can have kittens in an oven, but that doesn't make them biscuits. And so we know that we were not Americans like that, and many times we would want to know, I think for all of us individually who came from America, although we have in the house Ghanaians, we have in the house those from the islands, we have in the house Kenyans. Oh, no. Any Kenyans among you? Yeah. So, and you'll have a chance to meet them because we're going to invite you to attend New World Passover with us in Dimona on Revi'i and Kamashi. You're welcome to come. But this connection to Israel didn't just occur in a vacuum. Ben-Ami, our spiritual leader, Ben-Ami Ben Israel, didn't wake up one morning and just get a vision that said, let's go back to Israel. He was raised with the understanding that he was an Israelite, that his roots were in this land. And when you go back and you look at the slave trade, which, by the way, in Nasi Kiskiyahu, Prince Kiskiyahu, who is our first, not only our first citizen here in the land of Israel, but the first one to come from Liberia. We spent 2.5 years in Liberia. In 1968, he arrived here 1 month after Dr. King made the statement on the eve of his assassination that we as a people would get to the promised land. Prince Kiskiyahu, who you will hear from a little later.
Hallelujah.
We knew that when we got off those ships from West Africa into the Western Hemisphere, we knew that we weren't just any African people. And when you look at the migration patterns of people who were drawn from West Africa, you will find that they have what are called Hebrewisms. At least an English scholar, the dean would be proud to know that there was an English scholar, Williams, first name slips me. He wrote the book Hebrewisms of West Africa, From the Nile to the Niger with the Jews. And what he documents are Hebrewisms, or Hebraic cultural practices among the Ashanti, among the Ewe, among the Yoruba, among the Igbo, and many other allied tribes and ethnic groups in West Africa. And when you begin to look at those patterns, and when you look at when we got off these boats, literally naked, unable to carry artifacts and any traditions or written scrolls and what have you, very much like when we first left in the year 70, at the hands of the Romans. Likewise, we couldn't carry those heavy scrolls and artifacts with us, and we began to wander deeper into Africa. If a Roman presence from the north is moving into this land, which way would you be to retreat? It would make sense that many Israelites would have gone further and deeper into the continent of Africa. And so finding ourselves after 1,000 years or so in West Africa, we had those Hebraic ideas and thoughts and customs and even linguistic patterns. So when you look at the Ghanaian who speak Tree, when they say I'm coming, they say Meba. Well, Aniba. When they say welcome, they say Akwaba, Barukaba. So and I can go on, boy and beautiful and mother. All of them have very, very close linguistic connections. And so we were not just any people who ended up in the Western Hemisphere. We were drawn from West Africa, and if you got to know there were other people living there when the Israelites began to come into that area. And so when the slavers arrived, it was with collaboration of original indigenous people that the slaves were gathered up. Who would be the logical people to be sold into captivity other than those who were newcomers, relative newcomers, and bringing new traditions and ideas, and who were thought to be bothersome, pesky refugees and asylum seekers? Did Zachy get in the house yet? We have one of the brothers from Colo, and I'm glad to hear that the Africa Center is involved and the university is involved with the brothers down in Colo. I've been there 3 times personally. One of the other brothers here has been there several times. We have a close connection with them. I go down and talk with them and teach them. We consider that a university. It's not a prison as such. It's a university. It's an opportunity for them to learn and to be. Other than that, it's a waste of time. And the thing for us to learn from it is that these brothers, and in many cases some women, these people walked here, just like in antiquity. People walked here and back and forth in this land bridge, but at the corner of 3 major continents. And so we definitely know that there are many connections. It's hard to get around the issue of race in today's world. It's very, very difficult. I want to quote Dr. John Jackson, though, anthropologist at the University of Pennsylvania, now Dean of Social Policy and Practice there. And his one of his understudies here, Diana Burnett, is also with us in the audience. And she's building on some of those works in her own field. It's almost like, quote, it's almost like they've made it, he's speaking about us, it's almost like they've made it their business to say, let's look at everything we've been given, everything we take for granted, all the stuff that makes up the cultural common sense of the communities that we know and of the world generally, and let's just think about it differently. And that's us. We definitely, you're going to hear different ideas and different ways of thinking about things from us. The African Hebrew Israelites have been able to create a global sense of citizenship and belonging. This is Dr. Jackson speaking. It is a way of being in the world that's almost post-national. And that's very much how we function. The boundaries that exist between nation states, we feel to be absolutely and totally artificial. And as we move forward in the coming generations and epochs of time, all that has got to, of necessity, melt away. Because we as a human family are in trouble unless we learn how to share. And boundaries and borders are not how you bridge gaps and bring us into sharing. Of course, if the European Union has understood the necessity of doing that, if the African Union is struggling trying to understand that and being blocked and as a matter of policy being prohibited from doing such a thing, it's an obligation that we have to tear down these borders, tear down these boundaries between people. No longer will religion, language, politics, etc., or this pesky thing called race, this thing of ethnicity and skin color. So there are some limits and there are some boundaries that I'd like to just make a quick mention of, because for us, we're a spiritual community. It's hard to talk in an academic setting about spiritual matters. There's this paradigm that just is not conducive for that. But nevertheless, for us, God and spirituality is all about limits and boundaries. There's a limit to what you consume and remain healthy. There's a limit to how many cars you can operate at any one time before all of our air becomes like Beijing's. There's a limit to how many highways you can build in a country before it becomes a massive parking lot. There's a limit to how many lies your leaders can tell before they lose all credibility. There's a limit to how many cabinet positions you can have in a government. Okay? There's a limit to technology and what convenience that it can provide before you have, before these time savers have taken up all of our time. There's limits to productivity and to growth. You can't, there's limits in health. There's limits to how long you can maintain the integrity of surgeons in a system where the average profit from a successful surgery is $15,000, but when you botch the surgery, the profit goes to $44,000. There's a limit to how the integrity of the doctors that have to operate on us. There's a limit in a system like that. There's a limit in physics to how big of a super collider we can build and how small of a particle we can search for. But fortunately, there's a new idea in the realm of physics, the deep physics, that is focusing not so much on things, matter, but the relationship between things, and therefore that's where we come into play, because for us it's all about the relations and the relationships that we play. And we feel that in the area of anthropology and sociology is important for us to keep in mind, that new deep anthropology, a more sincere, a more sensitive, where we can become friends as Fran and Near and others have, and John and so forth, first name basis. I mean, that's how it's supposed to be as we dialogue and engage. And so I want to quote, looking at my time here, I want to quote from, I'll read the quote first. Is there no chance that a new historiography would invite those ancient Jews who have been forgotten by their descendants to reappear in the legitimate sphere of public memory? For now, it is difficult to predict whether the Israeli politics of identity will permit, in the early 21st century, the emergence of fresh paradigms for the investigation of the origins and history of Jewish faith communities. This is Shlomo Sand in The Invention of the Jewish People. And that might elicit a few groans and moans and what have you in the larger Israeli society, but I want to put you at rest. I don't agree with everything he has to say. Very rarely would we do that with most authors. I also read Jacob Neusner and Martin Buber, if it would comfort you. And I would like to quote Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who said that the Jewish people are a messenger who have forgotten their message. And so I think we all can relate to that. Somehow we've lost our way as Jews, as Hebrews, as Israelites, in understanding what the original intent was, to be a light unto the nations, to be that vehicle by which all the other nations would be blessed, and to be that entity that would lead the world, and not in technology and startups, etc., but in other areas that are more important to us. So, I agree that Professor Sand, some ancient Jews, no doubt forgotten by their descendants, have indeed reappeared on Israel's doorstep. But as you feared, Professor Sand, it remains to be seen if such fresh paradigms will indeed emerge into the mainstream of Jewish anthropological and historical academia. This is not to be confused with my hope that those communities necessarily merge into what has been called normative Judaism. We are opposed to that. Our community would from day one, we refused to convert. To convert for us would mean to deny that which we said we were in the beginning, before God and before man. We could not do that. We claim a linkage to this land they've done DNA tests now of the Lemba in Zimbabwe and in northern South Africa, but there was no move on the part of the absorption ministry and the Jewish agency to rush down and to bring the Lemba home. You know, there's been, in Haaretz, there's a fellow that argued for the fact that the 40 million Igbo of Nigeria also are connected to this land. There's been no move to go and to tie them in, but there has been a move to send down people who will build synagogues and who will single out certain of the young sons and bring them for training at yeshivot. I think that's a little twisting of what we're talking about here. Why? Well, Rabbi Shlomo Gordon, when he taught at the Minyan on Yom Kippur. I didn't bring it up here. Bear with me. Shlomo Gordon taught his followers in 1985, and this is from a Jerusalem Post article in 1985. He taught them that 150 years prior, when the first Jews from Europe were coming into this land, that they sent messengers to Ethiopia to ask Ethiopians to send 3 of their rabbis here to ordain the rabbis in Israel. So 150 years later, you're telling the Ethiopians that you have to convert according to halakha tradition, and now that they should take off their white turbans and robes and should wear fedoras and medieval Polish and Lithuanian cultural garb. That's disingenuous. That's disingenuous. It's not appropriate, and it's insensitive, and it's offensive. And we really have to open up our hearts again. We are Africans. Everybody in this room is an African, if we understand the out of Africa model. And so at some point now, again, have to deal with this issue. But this is not to rub this in anyone's face, but it is to cause us all to understand that we're all family here. We're all family. And in the end, our premise is that we can, once we accept the truth of this, it frees us up to then throw it all out. Because what does it matter? Because if we're searching for Jewishness according to genetics and DNA and what have you, wouldn't we really be looking for, if we take the premise that Abraham was the first Jew, which he was not, couldn't have been the first Jew if it was his grandson that was the first one named Judah or Yehuda. Wouldn't we be looking for Chaldean ancestry? What made Abraham the first Hebrew? Something came into his mind and allowed him to glimpse a higher understanding of what his calling was, and to leave Ur the Chaldees at a time when that civilization was at its peak. Not when it was falling, it was at its peak. What caused us to leave America in 1967? Ben-Ami received a vision that it was time for our people in that land to return back to the promised land. We set out. And so, got my little notice here. Let me get to my closing comments. As I said, I wanted to throw out this race issue after we dealt with it. Lots and lots I'm missing here. But none of this is stated in arrogance. It's not to incite vengeance or rage. But it is to allow us to start off on a new footing. And in quoting from another book, the book of Isaiah, because after all of our philosophizing, we'll now consult with yet another writer, the Hebrew prophet Isaiah. In the 56th chapter, Isaiah issues a proclamation about a time to come wherein no matter your narrative, whether an outcast of Israel or a stranger, that, quote, mine house shall be a house of prayer for all peoples. But prior to this often heard phrase, Isaiah promises even the stranger, quote, a place and a name better than of sons and of daughters. And so, it matters not whether our respective narratives are right. We might both be wrong. But what matters is that we are right and just in our actions, both toward the Creator and toward one another. And only in doing so can we ensure our place of belonging in this coveted fraternity. And that, brothers and sisters, is a humbling thought. So in returning to our African roots, we might gain or regain the perspective that will allow Israel to assume its sacred mission as those whom the Creator has chosen to be a light unto the nations. Toda.